Everybody, Andrew Cuneo here with another new YouTube video. This time I thought it would be fun to go over how the team I was testing with from the most recent set championship came up with the Orzhov Venture deck that Ely Cassis wound up winning the entire event with. I thought it'd be interesting, I guess, to show kind of a behind-the-scenes look to an extent of how a big testing team iterates on a deck and how we eventually came to the conclusion to play this deck. So we're going to kind of, this is the final product, but we're going to quickly jump back to what the initial versions look like. Just so we kind of set the stage a little bit. In testing, testing for this event was strange in that the only really established deck to beat was the Naya Runes deck. There had been a PTQ like a week before deck lists were due that was just absolutely dominated by Naya Runes, and that was the one bit of public information that everybody preparing for the set championship had, was that Naya Runes was the only deck that had actually done well in an Alchemy event. So that was very obviously the deck to beat. That was the deck we were focused on beating. And it really wasn't clear what other sorts of decks people would play. Like, we knew that everyone would either play Naya Runes or play a deck they thought beat Naya Runes, but what they would come up with that beat Naya Runes was just open to speculation. So we were trying a wide variety of things. We tried some blue-white decks. We tried the Jeskai Hinata decks. We tried like a mono-blue ninjas deck for a little bit. We tried to make green-red werewolves beat Naya Runes. And the way that these set championships work is that you have to submit your deck list the Sunday before the tournament starts. The tournament starts on a Friday. You have to send in your deck list the Sunday beforehand, so like 4 or 5 days ahead of time. The way our team usually works is we'll tend to have a team meeting, 3 or 4 days before the deck lists are going to be due, and then another team meeting the day that the deck lists are going to be due. And the team meeting the Thursday before the deck lists were due, a big chunk of our team just thought, we've been trying to beat Naya Runes and we haven't come up with anything that really beat it, so we should just register Naya Runes. And then there was another camp that said, okay, well, we haven't been focusing hard enough on trying to beat Naya Runes. And so basically this entire white-black deck kind of came about in this time span between that Thursday meeting and the Sunday meeting when deck lists were due. So what's on the screen now is Ely's actual deck that he registered, that he used to win the set championship. This is very similar to what everyone else on the team registered. There's a handful of minor differences if you compare lists. So Ely has in the sideboard 1 Cathar Commando, 1 Thraben Exorcism, 1 Dawnbringer Cleric. I think everybody played 3 white cards that could destroy enchantments and were intended to be boarded in against Naya Runes in these slots. Ely is the only person, I think, who registered a Cathar Commando on our team, so that's a minor difference. Another minor difference is there's an Intrepid Adversary, just as like a random 2-drop, and only 1 Valki, which that's another difference. If you look at everyone on the team's list, there's slight differences in how many copies of Valki were registered, how many copies of Precipitous Drop were registered, and whether or not an Intrepid Adversary was registered. I didn't ask Ely this, but I have to guess that after his experiences in the tournament where the Valki was so good for him, he probably would have preferred to have a second Valki over the Intrepid Adversary. And then there's slight differences in the mana bases across the team's list. So a lot of people played 3 Hive the Eye Tyrants, 3 Hagra Maulings. Some people played 4 Hive the Eye Tyrants. Some people played more Pathways. Some people played more Plains. So that's Ely's list. If you look at my list, which I did not do very well in the tournament. I started out 0-3 with this deck, which was quite sad for me. I have 2 Valkis, no Intrepid Adversary, and I've got more Pathways, fewer basics, but basically the same as Ely. So that's the final point. If we want to jump back in time to that Thursday meeting I was talking about, This is the list that Jan Moritz Merkel said he was working on that he thought really beat runes badly. And so this was kind of the starting point of the Venture deck. And if you look at it, there are no Venture into the Dungeon cards whatsoever in this list. It's basically a white-black mid-range deck that is trying to do the same thing that our deck wound up doing. We've got Archon of Emeria plus discard cards to protect the Archon of Emeria, or to clear the way for the Archon of Emeria against Naya runes. So your game plan is really just, try to make them discard anything that would interact with your Archon of Emeria, and try to make them discard Showdown of the Scalds. Then we've got a bunch of cheap removal to kill, any creature that the runes deck might try to grow, or to trigger, or to kill anything they might be targeting with the runes. And then there's also kind of this interesting Silver Quill Silencer card that you're going to see stayed in our deck for quite a while. And the idea behind this was you were seeing your opponent's hand a lot between the Duresses, the Humiliates, Concealing Curtains when it turns into Revealing Eye. So you would know what to name a large chunk of the time. So this is just going to be free damage, and you get to draw a card, and you're left with a 3/2. And also the Naya runes lists generally had a ton of 4-ofs. Even if you didn't know their hand, you could pretty comfortably name Showdown of the Scalds and expect that you would eventually get to trigger this thing as the game went on. And so this is kind of the core that the deck started with. We've still got the same, if you look at the 4-drops, they're very similar to what we wound up playing. We've got Wandering Emperors, we've got Citystalker Connoisseurs, although only 2 at the start. And we've got Hagra Maulings. We have kind of a different 5-drop, but there's the same idea that you're a mid-range deck that's going to want to play a few 5-drops. We got a lot of the same elements in the sideboard. We've got the Dawnbringer Clerics. We've got some Bloodchief's Thirst, the 4th Duress. Notably, we have Restoration of Eiganjo, which I got to play against John a fair amount while he was testing out Restoration of Eiganjo. This card is just awful. Jan eventually came to that same conclusion that it's just an awful card. I'd be surprised if anyone tries putting this in their deck at any point going forward. It's just truly terrible. So this was the pre-Venture list, and people were pretty excited about the idea that it beat runes, but there was a general concern like, okay, you beat runes, that's good, but what if you have to play against a non-runes deck? It seems like you got a lot of pretty bad cards in your deck. Namely the Humiliates. No one was a fan of the Intrepid Adversaries except for maybe Jan. Wedding Announcement is a good card in the right deck, but was this really the right deck for it? You don't really take that much advantage of the Anthem, and you're very rarely going to be drawing 2 cards, or drawing a card off of it because you attacked with 2 creatures. So we were excited that we had a deck that beat runes, but we wanted to experiment and see if we could push it further. And so that's where the Venture stuff starts coming in. This is Reed Duke's initial build with Venture. And if you look, you see that we've got just a ton of Venture cards here. We've got, in addition to the Triumphant Adventurers and the Nadaars, we've got the Precipitous Drops, we've got the Cloistered Gargoyles, we've got a Dungeon Descent. And so this was, we still have the same idea that, okay, we've got Discard and Duress and Humiliate, we've got the Archon of Emeria. This is how we're trying to cover our bases to beat the runes deck, and then we still have some cheap removal, a little bit less instant speed removal. But now our plan to kind of be a mid-range grindy deck is going to be venturing into the dungeon, namely with the Triumphant Adventurer being the best of the Venture cards pretty clearly. And then if you look at the sideboard, we've got 4 Dawnbringer Clerics. Like we still really wanted to have our deck be as strong against runes as possible. And then we've got, a lot of other just general black sideboard cards. We have March of Otherworldly Light making an appearance at this point, and we're up to 4 Citystalker Connoisseurs. I think one of the takeaways from watching the top 8 of the Neon Dynasty set championships to me is I think Citystalker Connoisseur is just the best card in Alchemy. Like the format overall, what is the most powerful card? I think it's Citystalker Connoisseur. a lot of the other teams brought decks that were based around the fables of the Mirror Breaker, and eventually you could set up a lock where you were copying a Citystalker Connoisseur inside your opponent's draw step every turn, so you were making it so they had to draw an instant or they just weren't even going to get to play their card. One kind of funny inclusion in this list from Reed is Gutmorn Pactbound Servant. And I kept talking to Reed, and I would ask him, have you cast this card yet? Have you had good experiences with it? Because if you go deep into the archives of my YouTube channel, I think you will find a video I made on a Gutmorn deck. And I played with Gutmorn a fair amount. It has a really powerful effect on the game, but it is really, really random. It is not clear that putting it in your deck actually helps you win more. It just makes the game stranger. And so I kept telling Reed, it's just not going to be a good card in this deck. Have you actually had good experiences with it? And he kept saying that he just hadn't even drawn it really in any of his testing games. Eventually, he just took it out of his deck. And I don't know that he's even cast it to this day, but I don't think it would. My experience with the card tells me there's no way it was going to be a good card in this deck. So I was also kind of excited about the Venture idea. I think unlike a lot of the people on our team, I'd actually played a lot with Venture cards, although in a different shell. I made some videos where I played with green-white Venture, like a sort of just an all-creature version of a Venture deck. And so my initial take on Venture was that the Triumphant Adventurers were going to be good, but the other cards like the Nadaar, the Precipitous Drop, the Cloister Gargoyle, they weren't going to be good enough in this kind of mid-range deck that wasn't super focused on venturing. So this was the list I built. And you can see I've got the Triumphant Adventurers, and I've only have the 2 Nadaars. I don't have any Precipitous Drops in my 75 at all. But I've still got the Silver Quill Silencers. I've still got 5 discard cards. I've still have the Archon of Emeria. I think we had 4 Archon of Emeria in our main deck from version 1 of this deck till the very end, because you have to remember we were really hard targeting runes with how we were building this deck. So this was my version in testing. The other thing I would say about this is there's no Lolths in the deck. I was never a fan of Lolth at all. So here I'm trying Legion Angel and Junji the Midnight Sky just to try having some different top-end cards. Legion Angel, I think, might have actually been a pretty good card for the tournament, the way it played out, because once you got to the top of the Swiss, it seemed like you were playing a lot of mid-range battles where just having something that was just a steady stream of value probably would have been worthwhile. So that actually might be a good 4-drop if you're looking to play Orzhov Ventures going forward and you just want to have a little bit more value for the mid-range decks. I would say maybe put two Legion Angels in your main deck and have 2 more on the sideboard. We still got the Reckoner Bankbuster in this list. I've always been a fan of the idea of putting Reckoner Bankbuster in your deck when you have 3 power creatures that are going to be good at crewing it. So we've got the Silencer here and the Nadaar. But as it turned out, the Venture stuff was better than I was expecting it to be in these lists. The Cloister Gargoyle was kind of a disappointment, but overall, I think that people were very happy to have 4 Nadaars in their deck, and it was still an ongoing debate within the team. Was it a good idea to play Precipitous Drop? Yes or no? And we weren't really sure, honestly, up until the Sunday. Even in our final discussions, people did not have confidence that they wanted to play 4 Precipitous Drops. This is Noah Ma's build, which I think is interesting for a couple of reasons. Here you see we've got the 4 Triumphant Adventurers, 4 Nadaars, but no Precipitous Drops. We do have a Dungeon Descent, which in my last build, I didn't point it out. I had a Field of Ruin, but Noah has a Dungeon Descent. Eventually, we came around to the idea that you should play 1 Dungeon Descent, and one of the interesting things about this is Noah has Valki in his deck, and he has the Dungeon Descent, and he has some red pathways, and obviously Forsaken Crossroads, and you can get the treasure from going through the Fandelver dungeon, whatever it's called. The mine tunnels give you the red treasure to make to cast Valki. So I think this was the first appearance of Valki in any of our lists, and I think that was a pretty important innovation. There's also, you can tell there's more experimentation going on with the 2-drops. We've got a Legion Warhound, which we tried for a little bit. I don't think anybody was really very excited about that one. We're down to 2 Silver Quill Silencers to kind of make room for some of these different 2-drops. You'll notice that there's like a sort of weird mix of 2-mana removal here. We've got Parasitic Grasps in the main deck, which this was in part, we really thought Werewolves was a pretty good deck. And if that warped our entire expectation for what people would play, because we thought Werewolves was a pretty good deck. And when you tried to build a blue-white control deck for the format, you could probably make your deck so it would be decent against runes, but in doing that, you just made it so your deck was awful against werewolves. Like, the blue-white control decks were just inherently awful against werewolves, which made it so that anytime we built a blue-white control deck, we were just like, okay, what if you ever have to play against werewolves? You're going to get absolutely destroyed. And if you look at the win rates from the people who did play werewolves in the event, they did well overall, and the people who played blue-white did not do well overall. So I think we were kind of correct in that analysis. One other really important aspect of this list is the 2 copies of Liesa Forgotten Archangel. No, it doesn't have them in the main deck, but I think this was the first time I saw them show up in a list like this, and I was pretty excited to see this. And we also have some other, you can see that we're trying a variety of things. So Noah had Disenchant. We hadn't gotten to the point where we were playing Thraben Exorcism in the sideboard yet, but there was this general sense that you wanted instant speed ways to remove enchantments against runes, because one of the really common things that happened in our testing was you would get an Archon of Emeria into play against runes, and then on their turn they would try to get it out of play with a Circle of Confinement, and then they would, play their big showdown turn. So you wanted instant speed ways to get the enchantment that was exiling your Archon off of the board. That's why Noah has switched to Disenchants here. Also, Noah was concerned about Oni Cult Anvil decks, and he wanted a little bit of extra coverage against those. Eventually, we decided that just to make the deck list better against runes, you wanted the instant speed away to get rid of the enchantments, but Thraben Exorcism also hits Spirits, which hits the Kami of Transience and the Generous Visitor out of runes, and that's why we wound up starting to have a mix of Dawnbringer Clerics and Thraben Exorcisms. And it's also why in Ely's final list he has a Cathar Commando, because the Cathar Commando is another card that can destroy an enchantment at instant speed. So I think from there, that was kind of the last of the big steps. So then if we just go back to Ely's deck, this is pretty representative of what everyone wound up submitting on the Sunday when the deck lists were due. One thing you'll note that is we've gotten to the point where we've got 4 Graveyard Trespassers in the sideboard, and I was a really strong advocate for this just because if you look at this main deck, you have a lot of cards that you're going to want to board out in a lot of matchups. Like, you're not going to want to have 4 Archon of Emerias in your deck post-board against most of the people that aren't playing runes. Occasionally you play against like a 3-color control deck, or somebody who's trying to play like Invoke Calamities, and maybe you still get some value off of the Archon. But for the most part, the Archon is a card you're going to board out in a lot of your matchups. So you need to have something you can board in there, and you kind of want to preserve your mana curve. So it's nice that the Graveyard Trespasser is a 3-drop. Also, there's these 4 Precipitous Drops in the main deck, which if your opponent's not playing small creatures, you're not going to want those in your deck. So you have to have something that's going to come in to cover those. You also have all these Duresses in your main deck, where if you're playing against White Weenie, you certainly want to take out your Duresses. You certainly want to take out your Archons. So the point being, you need to have cards in your sideboard that are flexible, that are going to be able to come in against aggressive creature decks, but are also going to be serviceable against control decks or against mid-range decks. And I think that's where the Graveyard Trespasser really shines, because I think it's good in a really wide variety of matchups. Also, if you're going to play against werewolves, it's perfectly fine to board in against werewolves, because if it ever flips to night, you get a really strong card. And just even if it's on day, you've still got a strong card that is going to trade with, it's generally going to trade with their 3-drops. And if they ever can't trade with it and it gets to start attacking, you're just going to take over the game. So I was a huge fan of the Graveyard Trespasser. Other things to note, you can see here we've got the Liesas in the main deck, and Lolth is gone. I think some people on our team did play Lolth, and given the metagame that actually did well in the tournament, I think having a little bit more top end would be fine in this deck. So whether that's Lolth or Legion Angel, like I suggested, or Sorin, some people are a big fan of Sorin. I think having maybe, 1 or 2 more cards like that in your 75 is completely reasonable. I would say going forward, even, you might not, if you're going to be playing this deck on the ladder, Runes is probably not going to be that popular anymore. So you could certainly think about moving Archons into the sideboard, or maybe, moving some of them into the sideboard, something like that. So there are ways you could continue to iterate on this deck, and I think you would want to, because this was a deck that we made with the idea, like, we just want to be as good against Runes as we can possibly be. And we want to have our deck just be reasonable against whatever other things people bring, because we didn't really know what other decks people were going to bring. Another thing I would note is here, Ely played only 3 Hive of the Eye Tyrants, which I was really strongly in favor of not playing 4 Hive of the Eye Tyrants, because I thought it was a card that was just, you're never really going to activate it against a Runes deck, and there's the risk that you wind up drawing too many and they start coming to play tapped against Runes, and that is a matchup where you need to be able to deploy your hand really efficiently so they can't run away with the game. That's why I wanted to only play 3, and I think I talked a lot of my teammates into doing that. But if you look at the decks that did well again, I think that that's much less of a consideration, and you would be pretty happy to play 4 Hive of the Eye Tyrants going forward. Certainly, I think you should play 2 Valkis and no Intrepid Adversary also going forward. If you're expecting to play a lot of black mid-range mirrors and you want to win those, Valki is a great card in those matchups, and Intrepid Adversary is kind of a stinker. One final note on this deck, which is something that I think people ask a lot, is what dungeon do you go through? Like, what's the strategy with the dungeons? And this one, the Lost Mine of Phandelver, is the one you should go in almost all of the time. Like, this should be your default dungeon. If you're in a spot where you're not sure and you're considering going into a different dungeon, just go in this dungeon. This dungeon is, like, consistently good. Things do not go wrong if you go into this dungeon. And I would say that, there's 2 really big pluses for this dungeon. The first one is it's a 4-step dungeon. It's very easy to finish. You get to draw the card, and you make your Nadaar a little bit better by having done that. The other thing, and I think probably the most important thing about going into this dungeon, is just generally in competitive Magic, if you're talking about something that's going to generate value for you over time, you want as much of the value front-loaded as you can possibly get. And this dungeon in particular, the first room you go into, Scry 1, is the best of the first rooms of any of the dungeons. The other one, like, each player loses a life. Certainly early on in the game, that just absolutely does nothing. That's only appealing really late into the game when your opponent is at a precarious life total. So them losing 1 life matters. This one, you gain 1 life, is probably even worse than your opponent loses 1 life. So Scry, like, what's the most impactful first room to go into? It's certainly Cave Entrance to get the Scry 1. Then the second step of this dungeon is, I think, probably the most interesting choice of any of the venturing choices you're going to make playing this deck, and it's, do you want the 1/1 Goblin or do you want the Treasure? And that's going to depend really heavily on how you foresee playing out your hand over the next couple of turns. Very often, if you're looking at making this decision on turn 3, it's going to be get the Treasure token, because it's going to allow you to play 2 spells in a turn faster, and that's just a really hugely impactful play you can make with a constructed deck. If you don't think that's going to happen, or if you're planning to play the Wandering Emperor and you might want to be able to protect it with a chump blocking Goblin a turn or 2 down the road, you might go in the Goblin Lair. Also, if you go in the Mine Tunnels is better. It does set you up for a worse choice for the 3rd step, is the thing. because you can always go in the Dark Pool. The Dark Pool is pretty lame. It's not a very impactful dungeon. The third step, the storeroom, is the most impactful of the third step, but I would say it is less impactful than getting the treasure. So I think you want to go into Lost Mine of Phandelver pretty much all the time and be mostly going into the mine tunnels in the second step. And then obviously getting to the fourth step and getting to draw the card is the big payoff of this dungeon. So you whenever possible, you want to avoid trading off your cards if it's going to mean you don't get to finish going through this dungeon. It's worth taking a little bit of extra damage to make sure you get through this dungeon, if that's a choice you get to make throughout the game. Looking at the other dungeons, if you watch the top 8, I think Ely went through the Dungeon of the Mad Mage at least once. It requires a pretty weird game state for that to be a good decision, because you need to be really confident that you're going to venture a lot over the course of the game. And you also need to feel like you really are going to need to get the max value from venturing, because if you can, so getting to the Mad Wizard's Lair is great. You get a ton of value on the way and you get a really big payoff, but you have to remember that it's 7 steps to finish the dungeon of the Mad Mage. If you go through the Lost Mine of Phandelver for 7 steps, you're going to be getting a good amount of value, and you're also going to be 1 step away from finishing the temple for the second time and getting to draw a second card. So if you look at pure value, the Dungeon of the Mad Mage comes out ahead of the Lost Mines of Phandelver over the course of 7 steps. If you look at getting to the 8th step, it's probably still ahead, but it's really not ahead by that much. And if you look at where you're at when you've only gone through 4 steps, you're pretty far behind, I would say, on the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. So this one, there's maybe a time and a place for it, but you really, really need to be confident that the game's going to go on for a long time and you're going to get to venture a lot. And so this, I would say, this is like a medium reward, high risk dungeon to go in, which makes it not a very good choice most of the time. This other dungeon, the Tomb of Annihilation, I think has a lot of the absolute worst rooms you can ever go into in terms of value. Obviously, Oubliette is just horrible. I don't think anybody ever went into Oubliette in any of our testing. Our deck is not set up so that that's something that you would expect to be able to do and yield a good result. Trapped Entry is just overall very weak. The Veils of Fear and the Sandfall Cell are also extremely weak because they affect you, and they also give your opponent an option as to whether they lose life or they discard a card. So it's kind of the classic Punisher mechanic in Magic, where you're giving your opponent the choice. They're always going to choose the choice that is the least painful for them. So you actually wind up getting less out of it than you might otherwise expect. Really, you should only go into this dungeon if your opponent is at a very low life total and you think that they're not going to be able to find a good option for the second or third steps, the Veils of Fear and the Sandfall Cell. If you're confident that both options are bad on each of those dungeons for your opponent, it makes sense to go into this dungeon. But if your opponent's at a high life total, the lose 2 life is going to be a really negligible effect. Also, if your opponent just has like a lot of cards in their hand and you suspect some of the cards aren't useful, then the second step doesn't really do much. Or if they just have a lot of lands, the third step doesn't do much. So this is another one of the dungeons where just a lot of stuff can go wrong for you, and the upside really isn't that high. So kind of the TLDR is just use the Lost Mine of Phandelver most of the time. And I think that pretty much covers it for this deck. I hope people enjoyed a little bit of a story of the evolution of this deck. This is something that you don't really get to tell very often in Magic, because if you look at where the competitive decks come from, they frequently just kind of come from the public at large, and you can't really trace how they progressed as cleanly as this. I thought it was fun to go back through this. It was useful to me, at least. So I hope that you guys felt the same, and if you did, please leave a comment. Also, I think this is going to be the video that gets me above 1,000 subscribers, which is a pretty big deal on YouTube, and it's been a goal of mine for basically the life of this channel. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, and you could be the 1,000th subscriber. Even if you're not going to be the 1,000th subscriber, though, please subscribe because you will be putting me that much closer to my next goal of 1 million subscribers. With that, thanks everybody for watching, and I'll catch you next time.